Florida preacher dismembered wife after he discovers DNA test exposes that his father fathered his 5 kids. Thomas Collins, a man who had everything, wealth, power, respect, and a seemingly perfect family, was a well-known preacher in his Florida town. His life appeared like a picture out of a glossy magazine. Revered in his community, Thomas was seen as a pillar of faith, the kind of man people trusted to guide them through life's struggles. His sermons were uplifting, filled with wisdom, and his image was pristine. Alongside him stood his wife, Rachel, and their 5 children, all of whom attended the church regularly, dutifully following in their father's footsteps. From the outside, everything about the Collins family screamed success. They were the ideal family, perfect in every sense. Thomas and Rachel had been married for over 2 decades, their bond the envy of many. Their children, each unique in their own way, were the pride of the congregation. The youngest, Ben, had just turned 7, while the eldest, Lily, was a teenager navigating the complexities of high school. They were bright, well-behaved, and all had aspirations of following in their parents' footsteps. Life for the Collins family was smooth and predictable, a life of luxury, faith, and the kind of social standing that others could only dream of. But what appeared to be a flawless existence was nothing more than a fragile facade. Beneath the surface, cracks had started to form, even though no one seemed to notice, until it was too late. Thomas, despite his public persona, had been quietly carrying a weight he could no longer ignore. The pressures of maintaining the family's reputation, the expectations of being the perfect leader, and the constant demands of running a large church began to take its toll on him. He tried to keep it all together, to project the image of the perfect, calm preacher, but deep down, he felt a gnawing emptiness, a lack of something he couldn't quite place. The catalyst for the unraveling of Thomas's life came when, at the insistence of his best friend and fellow churchgoer, he decided to take a DNA test. It wasn't something Thomas had thought much about before. He simply viewed it as a passing curiosity. At first, he thought it might be fun to see if he had any unexpected roots in his heritage. Perhaps a distant relative he never knew about, or maybe a family history that could provide some interesting insights. But this simple, seemingly innocent test would soon expose a truth far darker than he could have ever imagined. Thomas was not a man who dealt with surprises well, particularly when it came to his family. The thought of anything disturbing the carefully curated image of his life unsettled him deeply. And so, he waited. Weeks passed, and the test results finally came. With a shaking hand, Thomas opened the envelope. What he saw was a revelation, one that would send his world into chaos. The report showed that Thomas was, in fact, not the biological father of his children. The results indicated that his 5 children, Lily, Ben, and the others, did not share his DNA. His heart raced. What did this mean? His mind was swimming with questions, but the biggest of all loomed over him. Who was the father of his children? The test results were clear. There was one person who matched his children's DNA perfectly. It was not a stranger, nor someone from the distant past. It was his own father. His mind couldn't wrap around the words on the paper. His father, the man who had raised him, who had been there through every trial and triumph, the man who had mentored him in faith and life, was the biological father of his children. The weight of the discovery almost crushed Thomas. It wasn't just the betrayal from his wife that tore at him, but the deep sense of being deceived by the one man he had trusted the most. It felt like his whole identity, his entire understanding of family, had been shattered in an instant. Thomas's father, a well-respected figure in their community, had always been a pillar of strength for Thomas. He had taught him everything he knew about leadership, about running the church, and about how to live a righteous life. To learn that his father had crossed the line in the most unimaginable way was a blow that Thomas couldn't prepare for. His father had not just betrayed him, he had betrayed his family, his children, and their entire legacy. It wasn't just infidelity, it was a violation of everything Thomas had believed about the world and his role in it. Thomas confronted Rachel immediately. The words tumbled from his lips, his voice raw with hurt and confusion. "How could you do this?" he demanded. "How could you betray me like this? How could you allow my father to father our children?" Rachel, stunned, stumbled to find the words. She had known the truth for years, but had never dared to tell him. She was terrified, consumed by guilt, but more than anything, she was ashamed. Rachel explained that the affair had begun many years ago, when she was young and vulnerable. Thomas's father had taken advantage of her in a moment of weakness. It had been a brief, painful affair, but one that left a scar on both of them. Over the years, she had kept it a secret, buried it deep, never revealing it to anyone. But now, the secret had been exposed. Rachel's face was pale, her hands trembling. She begged Thomas to understand, to see that she was not the person he thought she was. She explained that her affair with his father had been one of manipulation, not love. His father had taken advantage of her trust and exploited her vulnerability, and it had haunted her every day since. She had been afraid to speak up, afraid of losing everything: her family, her place in society, and most of all, Thomas's love. But now, with the DNA test exposing the truth, she knew there was no more running from it. It was out there. The betrayal was out in the open. But even as Rachel spoke, Thomas's anger grew. His rage was not just aimed at her, it was directed at the man who had been his role model, his hero, the man who had shaped his entire life. How could he have done this? How could his own father, the very man who had preached faith, love, and forgiveness, commit such an unforgivable act? As his emotions swirled into a violent storm, Thomas's judgment clouded. His grief and anger mixed together, and in a terrifying moment, he lost control. The man he had trusted most, the one person who should have stood by him no matter what, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. And in his rage, Thomas did something that would change everything. The horrifying actions that followed would alter his life and the lives of everyone around him forever. The discovery of his father's crime triggered a chain of events so devastating that it would be years before Thomas could even begin to comprehend what he had done. The guilt, shame, and grief would stay with him as he faced the consequences of the shocking and tragic path he had taken. What happens next will stun you, and the twists and turns of this shocking tale are just beginning. Stay tuned as we unravel the mystery of the Alexander family's dark secrets, the devastating aftermath, and the quest for redemption in the most unexpected way. What drove Thomas to the point of violence, and could anyone, including him, find a way back? This is a story about betrayal, forgiveness, and the road to recovery that none could have foreseen. The confrontation between Thomas and Rachel was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced in his life. The weight of the betrayal, combined with the shock of the discovery about his children, left him speechless for a moment. He stood in the middle of their living room, the air thick with tension. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary, full of laughter and love, now seemed oppressive, suffocating. Everything he had known, everything he had worked for, had just unraveled in an instant. Rachel's words hung in the air like poison. She begged him to listen, to understand that it had been a mistake, a horrible, ugly mistake that she regretted every single day. But Thomas couldn't hear her. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and betrayal. How could this have happened? How could the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with everything, betray him in such a horrific way? His mind raced back to every moment he had shared with Rachel, every vow they had made to each other. It all seemed meaningless now. The thoughts swirling in his mind were like a storm that had gained too much momentum. The rage that had been building inside him for days, weeks, maybe even months, reached its boiling point. The anger that he had bottled up, suppressed under the guise of his perfect family life, erupted with no warning. He felt like he was losing control, and in that moment, all rationality flew out the window. His father, the man who had shown him how to live, how to be strong, how to lead, was the one who had destroyed everything. And now, he stood there, furious and helpless, with nothing but his raw emotions driving him. Rachel's attempts to explain fell on deaf ears. Thomas's vision blurred with tears, not of sadness but of rage. His thoughts fractured. How could she do this to him? How could she do this to their children? Was everything in their life a lie? As he stood facing her, the overwhelming grief began to morph into something darker. He could feel his heart pounding, his breath shallow. He couldn't think. He didn't want to think. He wanted to hurt. He wanted the pain to stop. He wanted everything to be different. Without warning, Thomas grabbed hold of a nearby object, something heavy and sharp, his hands trembling. He didn't know what he was doing, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All he could think of was his father's betrayal, the years of lies, the shattering of the perfect life he thought he had. He saw Rachel's face, the woman he had loved more than anyone in this world. Yet all he felt now was fury. The object in his hands felt as if it belonged there, as if it was an extension of the emotions coursing through him. Rachel's terrified gasp broke through his haze, but it was too late. In a swift motion, in an unhinged moment of madness, the unthinkable happened. As the blow struck, everything around him seemed to slow down. The world was muffled, as though he was underwater, his actions moving in slow motion. Thomas didn't know how he had come to this point, but now it was too late. The object dropped from his hands as he stood over Rachel, her body on the floor, lifeless. The room, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now frozen in time. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, and with it came a wave of horror that nearly drowned him. Thomas dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he touched her cold skin. His entire body went numb as the magnitude of the situation hit him. He had just taken the life of the woman he had promised to protect, to love, and to cherish. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. His mind was racing, but it was too late to take back his actions. The deed was done. His first instinct was to run, to escape, to disappear. But where could he go? What would he say? How could he ever explain what he had just done? He sat there in a daze, his head spinning, his heart breaking. The house, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on him, trapping him in the consequences of his uncontrollable rage. He could hear his children in the background, distant voices from another room, unaware of the nightmare that had just unfolded. Thomas knew that he couldn't stay there. He had to leave, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed by fear and guilt, knowing that nothing would ever be the same. His perfect family was gone, and in its place, there was only a shattered reality. The man he had once been, the preacher, the father, the husband, was now a stranger to himself. The next few hours were a blur. Police were called, and as they arrived at the scene, Thomas stood in the same spot, dazed and disconnected from the chaos unfolding around him. The officers found him standing over Rachel's body, his hands covered in blood. They immediately placed him under arrest. As they read him his rights, Thomas barely registered the words. His mind was a jumble of shock and disbelief. He had always preached the value of forgiveness, of redemption, of turning away from sin. But now, he had committed the ultimate sin, and no sermon, no prayer, could undo the damage he had caused. As the police escorted him to the squad car, the weight of the situation hit him with full force. He had thrown away everything: the respect of his congregation, the love of his children, the reputation he had built over a lifetime. All of it was gone, destroyed in an instant by one moment of rage. The people who had looked up to him as a moral authority were now left to wonder how a man of such faith could do something so monstrous. Thomas's thoughts were consumed with regret, but it was too late for apologies. The damage was irreversible. The trial was swift, and the courtroom was packed with spectators. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Thomas, using his actions as evidence of a man who had let his anger consume him. The defense, however, argued that Thomas had been pushed to his breaking point. He had been betrayed by those closest to him, and in his emotional state, he had acted impulsively. The weight of the crime was undeniable, but the defense tried to argue that it had been an act of temporary insanity, spurred on by the shocking revelation about his father's role in the betrayal. But no explanation could absolve him of what he had done. The jury found Thomas guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a fate that would serve as a constant reminder of the devastation his actions had caused. But even as he was led away in handcuffs, a strange sense of clarity began to form within him. Prison became a place of reflection for Thomas. His time behind bars was marked by deep self-examination and eventually a desire to make amends for his past. It was here, in the most unlikely of places, that he began his journey toward redemption. Through therapy, conversations with fellow inmates, and a renewed commitment to his faith, Thomas began to understand the true depth of his actions. He couldn't undo the past, but he could choose to learn from it and find a way to make a difference in the lives of others. Years passed, and Thomas became a mentor in prison, using his story of loss, guilt, and redemption to guide others who had made similar mistakes. His words became a beacon of hope for many as he shared the lessons he had learned about forgiveness, self-control, and the devastating effects of anger. He never expected forgiveness from those he had wronged, but he had found a peace in himself that allowed him to start anew. When the day came that Thomas was finally released, it wasn't to a life of luxury or recognition. Instead, he returned to the small town where he had once preached. But this time, it was as a man who had been humbled by his own actions. He sought reconciliation with his children, his community, and most importantly, with himself. Thomas's story became one of true transformation, proof that even in the darkest of times, redemption was possible. He had learned that no matter how deep the fall, there was always a way to rise again. As Thomas sat in his prison cell, the walls surrounding him felt like a suffocating reminder of everything he had lost. The weight of his actions pressed down on him relentlessly, and there were nights when sleep refused to come. His mind would race, replaying the devastating night over and over, the shock on Rachel's face as she had begged for his forgiveness, and the cold realization that the life he had once known was gone forever. His family, his reputation, his faith, everything was shattered. But amidst the darkness, there was a spark of clarity that began to emerge, slowly at first, like the first light of dawn, breaking through a stormy sky. He could feel a change, a quiet shift inside himself, as though he was beginning to see the world in a way he never had before. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something that happened overnight. But with each passing day, Thomas started to understand the depth of his own pain and the pain he had caused others. He began to realize that redemption wasn't something handed to him. It was something he had to earn through every action, every word, and every decision he made from here on out. Prison, despite the grim surroundings, became his crucible, the place where his transformation began. It wasn't the bars or the isolation that changed him. It was the time alone with his thoughts, the moments of deep reflection that forced him to confront the full extent of his wrongs. In the beginning, he resisted. The shame was too much. He wasn't sure if he deserved redemption, if he deserved a second chance. How could he, after everything he had done? But as the days wore on, something within him shifted. He began to see that there was more to him than the violence and rage that had defined him on that fateful night. There was still hope, still a chance to rebuild, if he could first learn how to forgive himself. The first step came in the form of a prison counselor. His name was Marcus, and he had seen it all: drug addicts, thieves, murderers. But he had never seen anyone like Thomas. The counselor could see the guilt eating away at him, but also a glimmer of something deeper. In their first session, Thomas could hardly speak. His throat tightened as he tried to explain what had led him to this moment, but the words wouldn't come. Marcus was patient, understanding, and slowly, over time, Thomas began to open up. He confessed every thought, every feeling, every regret. He admitted how his father's betrayal had ripped him apart, but more than that, how he had allowed that pain to consume him and drive him to act violently. Marcus listened, never judging, but offering something more important than anything else: hope. The more Thomas spoke, the more he began to see that the path to redemption was about owning his actions, not burying them or blaming others. It was about taking responsibility for the violence, the loss, and the destruction he had caused. And it wasn't just about forgiving himself. It was about making amends somehow for all the lives he had ruined. Rachel's, his children's, the lives of the people who had trusted him as a leader. One evening, as he sat alone in his cell, Thomas had a breakthrough. He thought of his children, Lily, Ben, and the others. He thought about the future they could have had, the future he had stolen from them. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could help them heal, even from behind bars. He began writing letters to his children, carefully choosing his words, hoping they would read them one day and understand. He wrote about his remorse, about how he had come to understand the depth of his wrongs, and how he was fighting every day to become a better man. It was a start, a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Over time, Thomas became a mentor to other inmates, many of whom had committed heinous acts of violence. He spoke to them not from a place of authority, but from a place of shared experience. He had been where they were, lost, angry, and broken, and he wanted them to know that they didn't have to stay there. He used his story to show them that even in the most hopeless situations, there was a way out. "It's not too late," he would say, his voice filled with sincerity. "It doesn't matter how far you've fallen. You can always rise again." The transformation was gradual, but it was real. Thomas's efforts didn't go unnoticed. Other inmates began to approach him for guidance, asking him about his faith and how he managed to hold on to it despite everything that had happened. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like he was doing something meaningful, something that might make a difference. He was still paying the price for his crime, but in that small corner of the world, surrounded by walls and bars, he was finally starting to build something again. A purpose, a sense of redemption, and a desire to make things right. Meanwhile, the outside world hadn't forgotten about him. His story had become well known in the media, with many condemning him for the brutal crime he had committed, but others were starting to see a different side to Thomas. Some began to view him as a cautionary tale, a man who had reached the pinnacle of success only to destroy everything in a moment of blind rage. But others saw him as something else, a man who had faced the worst of himself, who had broken down and rebuilt himself from the inside out. News outlets began to follow his progress, interviewing his fellow inmates, his prison counselors, and even his family, who, in time, had begun to see glimpses of the man Thomas was becoming. Thomas's children, despite the horrors of the past, began to communicate with him again, slowly and cautiously at first. Lily, now a young adult, wrote to him, asking about his journey. They spoke about their pain, their anger, and the fractured family they now lived with. But there was something else in her letters too. A glimmer of hope, the smallest seed that perhaps in time they could rebuild what had been lost. As for Rachel, she had moved on with her life, but the letters Thomas sent her were full of heartfelt apologies, an attempt to make peace with the woman he had hurt so deeply. But Thomas knew that he couldn't expect forgiveness from others right away, nor could he demand it. He had to prove, through actions, that he had changed. He couldn't undo the past, but he could show that he had learned from it. As the years passed, Thomas began to have a greater sense of peace, even in prison. His relationships with the other inmates grew stronger, and the regret he had once carried like a heavy burden began to feel lighter. He had accepted that redemption was not a gift. It was something that had to be earned, day by day, moment by moment. Then, one fateful day, a letter arrived from the parole board. After years of rehabilitation, counseling, and the positive changes he had made within the prison system, Thomas had been granted the opportunity for early release. The news hit him like a tidal wave, a mix of disbelief and hope. Could he truly be free again? What would life look like after everything that had happened? Could he ever heal fully, or would his past continue to haunt him forever? As Thomas stepped out of the prison gates, the world outside felt both overwhelming and unfamiliar. But one thing was certain: he was a different man. He had spent years trying to make up for the pain he had caused, and while the road ahead would be long, he was ready to walk it. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he had learned that even the most broken lives could be healed. Even the most shattered relationships could be mended with time, patience, and sincere effort. As he re-entered society, Thomas became a voice for those who had fallen, for those who thought there was no way back. His story was no longer just one of tragedy. It was one of hope, of redemption, and the power of transformation. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that redemption doesn't come from external forgiveness, but from facing the truth, embracing the consequences of your actions, and choosing to be better every single day. As Thomas began the next chapter of his life, he carried with him the painful but invaluable lesson that no matter how dark the journey, there is always the possibility of light. The years following Thomas's release were not as simple as he had hoped. The town, once his sanctuary, now felt like a foreign land. Every corner seemed to echo with memories of his fall from grace, and he could feel the eyes of his former congregation, his friends, and his community upon him. Thomas had spent so many years in prison, wrapped in his own thoughts and struggles, that re-entering the world outside felt like stepping into a world that had moved on without him. There was no parade, no joyous reunion. Instead, there were whispers, sideways glances, and the unspoken judgment that lingered in the air. But Thomas was no longer the man who had once been so consumed by his own image. The weight of his past, though still there, no longer held him down the way it had before. He had made peace with the guilt, the anger, and the despair that had driven him to the darkest moment of his life. Now he understood that his redemption, if it was to mean anything, had to be earned through actions, day by day, moment by moment. He found a small apartment on the outskirts of town, away from the gaze of those who might remember him as the once admired preacher. His days were filled with simple routines: waking early, reading, taking long walks to clear his mind, and working at a local community center helping troubled youths who were searching for guidance, much like he had been years ago. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but Thomas had come to realize that his work didn't need to be grand or world-changing. It only needed to be honest. In helping others who had lost their way, he found a new sense of purpose, one that was not rooted in wealth, fame, or recognition, but in simple, quiet service. Though his past had left him with a broken family, Thomas remained committed to rebuilding the fractured relationship he had with his children. It wasn't easy. There were times when he thought they might never fully forgive him for what he had done. Lily, his eldest, was the first to visit him after his release. She came, her face a mixture of confusion, anger, and uncertainty. It had been years since they'd spoken, and the gap between them felt like an endless chasm. She wasn't sure what to say, or if she even wanted to say anything at all. But in the silence between them, Thomas could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain that he carried every day. But there was something else there too, a small glimmer of something that resembled hope. Over time, their conversations began to shift. They talked about the past, about the trauma, the anger, and the pain. And slowly, painfully, Lily began to see that her father wasn't the same man who had committed such a horrific act. He was broken, but he was trying, and that was something she had never seen before. It wasn't easy for her to forgive him. No one expected it to be, but the seeds of healing had been planted. Lily started bringing her siblings to visit, and bit by bit, Thomas began to repair the relationship with his children. It wasn't the family he had hoped for, the ideal family that he had once dreamed of, but it was the family he could now build from the ashes. Rachel, on the other hand, remained a distant figure in his life. She had moved on, remarried, and started a new chapter for herself. She had found peace, but not with him. Thomas understood this. He didn't expect her to forgive him, nor did he feel entitled to her forgiveness. The pain he had caused her could never be undone, and he knew that some wounds never fully healed. But what he could do was respect her space, acknowledge the hurt he had caused, and continue working on himself. As time went on, Thomas found solace in helping others. The community center became his sanctuary, a place where he could work on building trust with the people around him. He found that his past experiences, his fall from grace, his time in prison, gave him a unique perspective on the struggles of others. Many of the young people who came to him were angry, lost, and consumed by the same feelings of hopelessness that had once controlled him. But he knew the path out. He had walked it himself. And with each conversation, each word of advice, each step forward, Thomas was not only helping others, he was healing himself. Though his redemption was a long and difficult journey, it was one that Thomas knew he had to take. He couldn't undo his past, and he would never be able to undo the harm he had caused. But he could choose to become a better man. He could choose to live each day with purpose, with humility, and with a deep commitment to making amends for the things he had done. Eventually, the news of Thomas's work began to spread. People in the community who had once judged him began to see the changes in him, the transformation that wasn't just about his outward behavior, but about his heart. Some came to him for advice, while others simply offered their support. Thomas didn't expect anything from them, but the kindness he received was a gift he never could have imagined years ago. In a way, the public judgment had begun to fade. It wasn't that they had forgiven him, they never needed to. It was that, over time, they had come to see him for who he was now, not who he had been. Years passed, and as Thomas continued his work, he began to feel a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. The guilt was still there, but it no longer consumed him. His relationship with his children grew stronger, and though Rachel remained out of reach, Thomas was at peace with that. He had accepted that his journey wasn't about finding redemption through others. It was about finding it in himself. The work he had done, the lives he had touched, the way he had changed, this was his redemption. He had paid the price for his crime, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to right the wrongs. One day, Thomas was sitting on a bench in the small park near his apartment when he received a letter. It was from Lily. As he opened it, his hands trembled. The letter wasn't long, but the words were enough to break the years of silence. Lily had written that she and her siblings had decided to visit him, to finally reconnect and rebuild what they had lost. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something better. An acknowledgement that the past couldn't be erased, but that they could move forward together, however slowly. Thomas's heart swelled with emotion as he read those words. The years of suffering, of trying to make amends, had led to this moment. It wasn't the perfect family he had once imagined, but it was real. And that, for Thomas, was enough. The road to redemption was long and painful, but Thomas had come to understand that it wasn't a destination. It was a journey. It was about showing up every day, facing the consequences of his actions, and doing the hard work of change. It was about finding peace in the small moments, the quiet victories, and the understanding that even the darkest paths could lead to light. As Thomas stood on the threshold of his new life, the weight of everything he had endured began to settle into something different, a quiet sense of acceptance. His journey, from the man he had once been to the man he had become, had been nothing short of transformative. And while he knew he would never fully escape the shadows of his past, he had learned how to live with them. In fact, he had learned to embrace them, to use the lessons of his darkest moments as a source of strength. His relationship with his children, though still healing, had reached a place of mutual understanding. They weren't perfect, and they didn't pretend to be. But there was love there now, something he hadn't dared hope for in the beginning. With every visit, every letter, every phone call, Thomas could feel their bond growing stronger. They weren't going to erase the past, but they were building something new, something they could be proud of. In those quiet moments, when he would sit in his small apartment reflecting on his life, Thomas couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude for how far he had come. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about wealth. It was about the peace he had found, the growth he had achieved, and the understanding that redemption was a journey, not a destination. It was something that came through the hardest work of all, facing yourself, confronting your past, and choosing to live better each and every day. The community that had once turned its back on him was now starting to see him differently. The work he did at the community center, helping troubled youth, mentoring those who had lost their way, had earned him respect in places he never thought he'd be able to reach. The media that had once sensationalized his fall from grace now quietly acknowledged the man he had become. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone anymore. He was simply trying to do better, trying to live with integrity, and hoping, above all, that his story might serve as a lesson to others. But Thomas knew that the journey was far from over. There was always more to learn, always more work to be done. No matter how much progress he had made, there was still a part of him that was forever shaped by his mistakes. That was something he would never escape. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it was a reminder that no one was perfect, that redemption didn't come from perfection. It came from striving to be better, to do better, even when the world seemed unforgiving. And this is where you, the viewer, come in. Thomas's journey is one that resonates with many of us. Whether it's facing the consequences of past mistakes, dealing with the weight of guilt, or simply trying to find our way after a tragedy, his story reflects something universal. It's the story of perseverance, of facing your demons and choosing to fight for a better life. It's about hope, forgiveness, and the quiet strength that comes from understanding that no matter how dark the path, there is always the possibility of light. So, what do you think? Do you believe in the power of redemption even for those who have committed unforgivable acts? Can someone truly change? Or are we forever defined by our past mistakes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have an open and honest conversation about the real-life struggles of redemption, forgiveness, and healing. I want to hear from you. What's your opinion on Thomas's journey? Do you think he truly found redemption, or is there more to his story that still needs to unfold? Could you forgive someone for the worst mistakes of their life? Let's dive into these questions together and start a meaningful dialogue. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel. By joining this community, you'll be part of a group of people who are unafraid to have the tough conversations, to explore complex human stories, and to reflect on the deeper truths that bind us all together. Your opinion matters, and by subscribing, you'll be able to keep up with all of our future stories, analyses, and discussions. Thank you for being here, for taking the time to reflect on this journey with me. If Thomas's story has touched you in any way, let us know in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going, and together, let's explore the power of transformation and the hope that exists even in the darkest of times. Remember, no matter where you are in life, no matter the mistakes you've made or the struggles you've faced, it's never too late to change. There's always a way forward, always a chance for a fresh start. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Keep believing in the possibility of redemption.